Good morning and welcome to the finnCap Tech virtual demo for D4t4, presenting the Celebrus fraud data platform. The webinar is recorded and consists of an introduction, a demo, and then Q&A relating to the product only. The company will not be presenting any new financial information and will not be commenting on current trading in this webinar. It's my great pleasure to now pass you over to Bill Bruno, Deputy CEO of D4t4.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Bruno. I'm the Deputy CEO at D4t4 Solutions, the parent company of our Celebrus suite of products, and extremely excited to walk you through our latest product to bring to market today, the Celebrus Fraud Data Platform. And so what we're going to do is I'll provide a little bit of backdrop into some of the research and activity and development that's gone on over the past couple of years internally at D4t4. To give you just a sense of the market, a sense of the challenges that we're looking to solve for organizations across all industry verticals. And then ultimately, I'll throw things over to Phillips, our CTO of the Celebrus product line, to walk you through an actual live demo, because I think personally that brings it to life and really hits home sort of the challenges that we're looking to solve for. And so in looking at the market, and just to give you a high level sense of how we see things, unfortunately, when you go across the globe, fraud threats continue to increase in every market around the globe. And the two key challenges that really are coming to the forefront, regardless of the type of fraud from a digital perspective that you're looking at, is ultimately that most organizations on average are only recovering about 25% of the fraud losses that they're incurring. So when you think about that, and you think about the fact that fraud is occurring much more quickly, there's a need and an opportunity to intervene at the start of a fraudulent activity in an attempt to stop the money from leaving the wallet, so to speak, instead of looking back and seeing how much money is already gone. And ultimately, there's a few key struggles that are coming into play for organizations. One, back to my previous comments around the sort of time frame for capturing or catching fraudulent activity before it happens, is an extremely small window. Almost half of all fraudulent cases are happening within a day and within a moment, particularly on a digital perspective. But secondarily to that, organizations that are trying to sort of stop fraud, have an opportunity to intervene, but you also don't want to create a negative customer experience if that just happens to be me, a consumer of that particular brand, or yourselves as a consumer of that particular brand. And so balancing the opportunity to intervene and stop fraud before it happens, while also making sure that you're creating a positive customer experience for consumers, because globally consumers are expecting and demanding that positive experience, left an opportunity for us to bring the fraud data platform, or FDP, to the market, particularly because when it comes to identifying or catching the fraudster before the fraud, there's a subset of data that's required in real time to do that. And we saw the opportunity to create that data. And in the industry, it's referred to as behavioral biometrics and behavioral analytics. Now, ultimately, in most organizations, when you think about the fraud management process, there are sort of 5 key challenges that organizations are looking to solve for, that we saw, again, an opportunity to have the fraud data platform address and solve for and provide a much more efficient process. It's reducing the fraud losses. That's a bit of a no-brainer. But also reducing the false positives to improve the customer experience, so that if I happen to find myself in London and I'm buying a coffee on my way to the office, ultimately that transaction is allowed because that's common behavior for me, and my financial institution knows that that's me. When you dig into the fraud management process, there's a massive opportunity for efficiency, and there's also a massive need to be aware of the upcoming threats, because when you think about the fraud world, generally speaking, if something has been written about in the fraud sector, the fraudsters have already moved on or evolved and are changing their methods and methodologies for trying to create this activity in the first place. And so the fraud data platform, from our perspective, will look to solve for 3 high-value use cases: account opening fraud, account takeover fraud, and payment fraud upon our initial launch. The demo that Ant's going to do will actually focus on account takeover fraud, but as you can see from the numbers on the screen, the increases in the amount of money at risk, especially when you think about the fact that only 25% of this money is typically recovered, is a massive challenge for organizations and a massive opportunity for the Celebrus Fraud Data Platform to help organizations better solve for this. And so introducing the Fraud Data Platform, what you're seeing up on screen is a lot of information. At the forefront of our data capture, built on the pedigree of the Celebrus customer data platform that's been in the market for over 22 years, is actually focused on capture from what's called legitimate interest. So when you look at GDPR, you look at CPRA in the states and various other state legislation and other privacy legislation around the globe, there's a carve out that exists within all of those focused around risk and fraud data. So if you're capturing data for risk and fraud, it falls under the category of legitimate interest. And that is the legal basis of the data that's captured by the fraud data platform, and a fundamental difference between the Celebrus customer data platform and our now new to the market customer fraud data platform. And you'll see that there's a ton of information here, the various signals that we can capture about an individual, the data that we can enrich our data sets with, device information, network information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you'll see all of this brought to life by Ant here shortly from a demo perspective. So the final thing I want to touch on before turning things over to the demo is this is typically what a fraud management process is going to look like in an organization. And what you'll see within the demo, whether we're talking about fraud strategy, is our ability to provide risk indicators and scorecards along the way to help organizations catch the fraudster before the fraud. You'll see our real-time data collection and the behavioral biometrics and analytics that I mentioned previously. You'll see our ability to replay sessions to aid the case investigation internally within organizations as our data is ported into data science and analytics models or into fraud management platforms that our data can be readily accessed and utilized within. You'll see the identity graph and frankly, our industry best solution for identity and identity verification in the fraud sector. And then finally, you'll see our data model and the richness of the information that we're able to provide in milliseconds to downstream fraud management platforms to not only help catch the fraudster before the fraud, but to also allow organizations to keep an eye out for evolving threats and to look at their business as a whole to determine the best way to protect their own organization and their consumers as well. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and throw things over to Ant to dive into the platform. Thank you so much for taking the time, and hopefully you'll be as excited as we are upon seeing the demo of our fraud data platform.
Okay, thank you, Bill. We've got perhaps 20 minutes, 25 minutes to walk you through a demo of the new fraud data platform. I'm going to pick up on some of those things that we were looking at in those slides. When we talk about what's coming in the fraud data platform, those three key broad use cases, we have new account fraud, we have account takeover fraud, and we have payment fraud. And in the product, we have technology which focuses or solves for all three of those areas. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the middle of those three broad use cases, which is the account takeover fraud. And the technology we have in the product to address that is called behavioral biometrics, and I'll explain all about what that means as we go along. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can take a look at the fraud data platform. And hopefully you can now see my screen. So what you see on screen here is an early access release of the fraud data platform. I'm going to just work through this at a fairly quick pace because some of the details are really not that important. I want to focus much more on the sort of concepts and the key messages and the key areas which we're adding value. So I'm just going to go ahead and log into the fraud data platform. And the first thing to show you, for those of you who are perhaps less expert or less knowledgeable about Celebrus, is, well, when we talk about data and the rich data that we collect, well, exactly what does that mean? And to bring that to life, I'm going to show you a very simple browsing session on the HSBC website. This could be on any website, but I'm just going to use HSBC. And to do that, I'm going to use this special browser. This is just a Firefox browser, but it's set up to send data to my local Celebrus system, which is just an early access release of Celebrus running on this machine. So it's very quiet. There's no other traffic going through it. And for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to do a fairly unrealistic browsing session. I'm just going to role play being a student for a couple of minutes. Perhaps I'm living away from home and I need to get into a student account. This is just to get some data for us to explore the fraud data platform with. Perhaps also, since I'm living away from home, almost certainly will need some contents insurance. And being Generation Z, I will of course do the majority of my banking in mobile. And actually that's all I'm going to do. I just want to get a bit of data into Celebrus. Switching back across into the fraud data platform, you can see that we've been collecting data in real time. And as always with Celebrus, I haven't had to do anything to collect this rich data. This is something that we do out of the box. You simply add us to your website or your mobile application, and we just collect everything that happens to every visitor and every user of the mobile application. Now I've got a bit of data in the system. I'm going to change views and just do a bit of analysis on it, which is what this tool lets me do. You can see each of these rows in this table is essentially an event. It's something that happened to the visitor in their mobile application. Some of these things are really fine-grained, like for example, every time I click on something, we collect an event to say what was clicked on. Every time I visited a page on the HSBC website, we collect an event to say what page we visited, and so on and so forth. I just want to focus in on one particular kind of event because it's really interesting and important to what we do in fraud, which are these signals events. And what these do are when we see a visitor moving to a new page in their web application or a new view in their mobile application, we can use machine learning to analyze the page that they are on and derive from that some business meaning. So you may remember in that short browsing session on the HSBC website, I went to a student banking page, first of all, and the machine learning tells us that actually what Ant is interested in is student banking. And then I went to a page about content insurance, home insurance, and the machine learning says, right, Ant's now showing an interest in home insurance. And finally, I went to a page which was all around mobile banking. And if you think of that in the terms of customer experience, you can probably see how easy that is or how applicable that is to personalization. If I show an interest in home insurance, it doesn't take a great leap of faith to sort of understand what kind of offer or personalized message might make good sense to me as a visitor. As it turns out, this data is equally valuable in a fraud detection space, because if we understand how someone uses the application day to day, like when I do my online banking, I typically log in, do transactions, payments, perhaps statements as well. That's my very familiar profile, my biometric profile of how I use the application. And if I show those same signals day to day, then it's a good chance that it is the same person, i.e. me, using my account. If someone else comes onto that account and starts using it, somehow they've guessed or got hold of my login credentials, then that's part of the evidence that says perhaps this account has been compromised by someone. So all of this data is what gets fed in real time into the fraud data platform, and more specifically, the behavioral biometrics, which I'm going to show you in a moment, to do the fraud detection. The last thing to say just before I move off this page is each of these events has a whole heap of really valuable data collected within it. I've just dived into that signal event, and we can see that this event says all sorts of things about the visitor. It says what kind of device I'm using. In this case, I'm using a Windows 10 PC. It's a Firefox browser. It tells me where in the world I'm coming from, the geolocation. It's an English language browser. We can see more details on geolocation to see that I'm coming from Romsey, Hampshire in the UK, even my geolocation, my GPS location, even my ISP. We can see who I am if I've logged into the site, how I arrived on the site. Really, really deep and rich information. And that's exactly the kind of information that you need to do effective fraud detection. Okay, so that's the first part of the demo, which is really bringing to life the data. And that's exactly what we say, of course. We're all about the data. That is our company headline, and that brings it, hopefully brings it into concrete terms, what that means for the fraud data platform. The next question then is, well, what can you do with that data? And there's two parts to that answer. The first is around our analytics capabilities. This is a tool, an app within our product called the Data Loader. And this is the tool we use to load an analytics data model. Where we load it, well, that's entirely up to the customer. We're not prescriptive about where we load our data model. You can load it into any of these kinds of systems, old school analytical systems like Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL. If If you want the data just as files, that's fine too. Or if you want our data loaded into some of the new wave of cloud native data warehouses like Azure Synapse, which is Microsoft's headline analytics tool, a Snowflake or Teradata Vantage, that's absolutely fine. And what we provide is a really rich set of tables, and it's a bit easier to understand the nature of these tables if I group them together. You can see there's a set of tables which explain what kind of device visitors are using, e-commerce type activities, things which people are doing in forms, like application forms, a set of fraud tables, geolocation, i.e. registering the fact of where someone's coming from, a visitor is coming from in the world, and so on and so forth. There's about 120 tables now, and basically these tables collect absolutely everything which happens on digital, everything that happens in mobile, everything that happens in web for your particular domains, your particular digital estate. And the purpose of these tables is to answer two particular pressing questions in the fraud detection world. The first is around interventions. So in the fraud world, it is extremely important to understand the impact that putting fraud detection is having on your customers. Customers are very sensitive to putting friction in their customer journey. If you deploy some new fraud detection and you're putting friction in the customer journey by asking them to log in multiple times or do additional security checks, what kind of impact is that having on your customers? Are you creating discontent and ultimately churn? Well, the only way to know that is to measure it, and the only way to measure it is to have data, and that's what these tables tell you. They tell you which individuals are coming to your site, what they're doing, how long they're spending on the site. It can answer all those key questions around customer experience and therefore measure what kind of impact your fraud detection is having on your audience, on your customers. The second really key part of the data model is to understand emerging threats. Now, fraudsters spend their whole life working around fraud detection, trying to find new ways into your site, into your digital estate, trying to work around your fraud detection techniques. The only way to understand how they're trying to work around those and to detect those emerging threats is to have the data. And again, it's this set of tables, it's this data model which provides that underpinning so that your data scientists and your data analysts can look for new emerging threats and prepare the fraud detection techniques ready to stop them. All of that is not so much real time. Typically, the data is in these tables within a minute, within 60 seconds of it happening on the device. So within 60 seconds of me doing something on the mobile application or website, the data for that will be within these tables. And it provides an incredible place to do all that kind of analysis and machine learning and so on. For the real-time fraud detection, or as we call it, catch the fraudster before the fraud, I'm going to show you a different tool, which is called our Fraud Explorer. And this is where we really get into the behavioral biometrics part of the fraud data platform. To show you the behavioral biometrics, I'm just going to skip through a couple of dialogues pretty quickly. And this tool is going to let me explore and understand and simulate what behavioral biometrics does when you deploy it to the fraud data platform. And the core of behavioral biometrics is a biometric profile. And this is a set of data which is collected for each individual separately. So everyone has their own biometric profile, and it's collected over a series of browsing sessions or application sessions. So each time I use the application, the mobile banking application or the website, we collect more behavioral biometrics data for that individual. And you can see the sort of data which is collected. It's listed in here. This is our out-of-the-box behavioral biometric profile, and it contains a really rich set of data. To give you a few examples from this, we can detect, for example, when the visitor is trying to anonymize their IP address. That's a really familiar technique that fraudsters use to hide where they're coming from in the world when they arrive on a website. We can detect what kind of device they're using, because obviously the device we use is normally pretty stable from one browsing session to the next. I might use my home PC and my mobile phone, and often that will be the same from one session to the next. You can see there's other fairly straightforward pieces of data, like the time of day when an application is used. Often people check their bank accounts first thing on a Monday morning, to give you a concrete example. Other pieces of data, geolocation, where people come from in the world, is very stable from one visit to the next. And then we get down into some really quite granular data. So for example, we can collect gesture data, which says the touch screen pressure, or the pressure that my fingers exert on my touch screen device, like my phone or tablet, is pretty constant. The size of that contact point is pretty constant as well. My fingers are obviously a different size to other people's fingers, and therefore this is specific to each individual. And all of that is evidence which is put into my biometric profile to say what are the characteristics which are for ants browsing devices and browsing behaviors. Just to bring that all to life, I'm just going to switch across to the test tab. And at the top here, you can see here is a browsing session, essentially the same browsing session we were looking at earlier. And at the bottom here is the biometric profile, all the different data points that we collect. And I'm going to play this browsing session through as if it was happening in real time. So just one event at a time. You can see we're just starting off now. The visitor's just landing on the site. And straight away, you can see we're starting to collect some evidence. It's not very much. It's only just started. We are literally a second into the browsing session, and we've already got a whole bunch of evidence about what this is, who this individual is and where they're coming from. We know that they're using Windows PC. We know they're coming using a Firefox browser. We know, for example, that this browsing session is also coming from Hampshire in the UK, using Virgin Media as the ISP. You can see this evidence just continues to be collected and expand as the browsing session proceeds. So in this case, we've got a little bit more evidence now. We know a bit more about the actual device itself and so on. We know the time of day is between 11 and 12 in the morning and so on. And that's the purpose of all of that, is to collect evidence for their current browsing session. What are they doing right now? But the really interesting thing happens is when we compare their current session with their historical biometric profile, everything we've collected about them in the past. And to bring that to life, I can show you this Verify tab. The Verify tab is essentially the same replay of a browsing session. It's just the same sequence of events that happened in that browsing session. But at each step through that session, we're going to score their current session with their historical biometric profile. And right at the start, we don't have enough evidence from their current session to do that scoring. But very soon, I mean, literally within just a couple of seconds, we've got now enough evidence to say that actually we've seen this device before. We've seen this person or seen this device used on this website before. We've collected some evidence and we can be pretty sure we know who it is. And bear in mind that the visitor hasn't logged in yet. They haven't logged into the application, and yet we can be pretty sure we know who they are. And that's what this verification score of 110 tells us. It gives us enough evidence that we have been able to verify them. And I can explain that verification score by looking at the evidence from their biometric profile. So these two columns are the things to focus on. This middle column is all the data collected from their current session. And the column on the right is all the previous sessions, so all their historical profile. And you can see that this particular session was between 11 and 12 in the morning. And indeed, we've seen previous sessions from this individual between 11 and 12, 1 and 2 in the afternoon, and 5 and 7 in the afternoon. They're using Firefox. They've used Firefox before. It's an English language browser. We've seen English language before. All their device matches up. Their geolocation is GB, Hampshire in the UK. And indeed, we've seen them actually coming from the UK and also Spain. So it's one of those kind of known locations. So there's enough evidence here now to say that actually we can be pretty sure we know who this individual is. And actually, just a little bit further on, we can see the individual actually does, the visitor does indeed log in. That's what happens here. And at this point, not only have they logged into the website, so they've been authenticated, but we've also been able to biometrically verify that they are who they say they are. And again, their evidence just continues to be monitored in real time, continuously, all the way through the browsing session. In fact, just down at the end here, near to the end of the browsing session, something really interesting happens. You might have noticed there that the score just ticked up. The verification score ticked up from 110 to 120. Just explaining that score, you can see that change was because of a signal. So this ties back to what I was showing you in that data collection part right at the start of the demo, where we're looking at the different signals. We're using machine learning to understand how someone is using the application. And in this particular browsing session, the visitor interacted with the mortgage calculator, and we'd actually seen them do that in previous browsing sessions. You can see that's what this piece of data on the right here is telling us. And therefore, that is consistent. What they're doing now, the way they're using the application, is consistent with what we've seen them do in previous sessions. So it's more evidence that they are who they say they are. And the key to all of this is to say, well, individually, any of those pieces of data in the biometric profile doesn't tell us whether someone is a fraudster or not. It is the holistic whole of all of that evidence combined which gives us the picture of whether, in probabilistic terms, this individual is or isn't who they say they are or who we think they are. And ultimately, while we're doing this verification continuously and in real time in every single session, for every single visitor and every single user of a mobile application, when we do detect some situation, which I'll show you next, then that's when we make or send a signal to the fraud management system to say, actually, there is something on this account which is suspicious, and therefore the account may have been compromised. Now, in this particular session, it's a very different session. You can see things go sideways pretty quickly early on. We're able to detect that actually there is some really unusual behavior. And at this point here, even though we are just almost a fraction of a second into the browsing session, we have enough evidence to say that actually there is someone unusual using this account. Just to explain where that score comes from, we've got some evidence which shows the individual is trying to hide their IP address. They're coming from an unusual part of the world, in this case Japan, when we would expect them to come through Spain or the UK. There are actually a couple of bits of evidence which do line up, Firefox and Windows. Not unusual because those are so common, of course, but nonetheless there's enough evidence to say something is unusual on this account. And that signal, that event that something is unusual, is sent to the fraud management system, and it's part of the data which the fraud management system uses to approve, block, deny payments. So if you saw a high value or high risk transaction going through on this account, perhaps the visitor adds a new payee and immediately transfers out a large sum of money, then this evidence to say that this account potentially has been compromised, along with that high risk transaction, would block that transaction from going through until a fraud investigator has had an opportunity to review it and either approve or deny it. So this in and of itself is part of the broader picture of fraud management. The fraud management system that we interact with is ultimately responsible for blocking and approving payments, and we are providing a valuable source of evidence to that system to say what's going on digital. And the ultimate reason for all of that is because there is such good evidence that digital is providing, but it is an extraordinarily high volume of information. If you imagine one of our big global banking customers, they may have 10, 20, 50,000 customers on their site at any given time. And that volume of data is far too high to just feed all of that into a fraud management system. The fraud data platform's role is to boil all of that data down into just a small set of signals to say, these are the high risk accounts, these are the ones that you need to look out for, because creating hundreds or thousands of false positives doesn't help anyone. Ultimately, the fraud investigators need the high value accounts where there is something suspicious, which we can target using this digital data. That's the biometrics. Just to finish off, one last thing to show you. We also provide forensic data analysis and a whole set of other tools. I'll show you this just in passing before finishing. Forensic data analysis gives you, or gives the fraud investigators and fraud analysts, more often the fraud data analysts, the tools to understand, well, Celebrus flagged up this account, it looks suspicious, but what actually has happened on that account? So looking at this particular individual, that number up at the top there, may not look to you much like an individual. It doesn't look like an email address or an account username, but actually that does uniquely identify an individual. It's part of the product. It's called our identity graph. It's a really, really key foundation for how we identify individuals. And for this individual, you can see they've had something like 12 browsing sessions spread over, excuse me, spread over several days. And this data is used by fraud investigators to dig into the system to understand exactly why particular accounts appear to be compromised. It gives them all the information they need, and it's also a really valuable tool for understanding those kinds of emerging threats. So if we see new behaviors, you can track back for any individual what their browsing sessions were, why it was suspicious, what was going on in those. It's part of that chain of trust of understanding exactly what is going on in the system. Okay, that's probably enough demo for one day. We've looked at, hopefully we've brought to life what we mean by our really rich data. We've looked a little bit at our data model and all the tables and the use cases that supports, the fraud, or rather catch the fraudster before the fraud, and our real-time behavioral biometrics, and then a little bit around the forensic data analysis. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Ant. That was a very good run through. I've got a selection of questions which I'll try and group together under the same topics. And if I could ask you to answer these. First one would be, what are the key elements of a successful fraud platform, and how does D4t4 compare to rivals on these with Celebrus?
Yeah, okay, so I think that the thing which has been missing a lot from the fraud management space, for example, trying to detect car payments, is this ability to weave evidence and signals from digital into that. And that's, I think, is perhaps the single most important thing which the Celebrus fraud data platform is bringing to the market, is ability to collect and analyze really rich data from digital and then provide just those key signals. I was sort of alluding to this or walking around this when I was talking about the behavioral biometrics, is of all those thousands of things which are happening on digital at any given time, let's just get all of that noise boiled away, get it down to the key signals, and get that into the fraud management system. Because ultimately, Celebrus isn't the platform where that decision, that ultimate decision, is being made. There are other signals going into fraud management systems, from payment systems, from banking systems, from contact centers, who knows from where else. So the fraud management system, whether that's a SaaS or a GB group or a FICO or a BAE system, those are the systems which are really doing the key decisions. And we are providing a valuable source of evidence into those to enrich the kind of decisions that it can make. So we are a part of that supply chain of data, but ultimately we are feeding that data into those downstream fraud management systems.
And I think the next question follows on from what you've just been saying, that the question is this just data delivery? Is it just up to the client to decide how to use it?
Yes, ultimately it is, because I think in every deployment of the fraud data platform will be integrated with a fraud management system, because that is the end-to-end use case right there, is to get data from digital, get it processed and analyzed and delivered at the right time in the right way to the fraud management systems. But having said that, we also have customers who we know very well from the marketing world, from our CDP platform, that are very expert around using our data for marketing purposes and elsewhere as well. And for those customers, they may well want to build their own machine learning models. They want to use our data model, which I touched on with when we looked at the data loader. They want to use those tables and all the rich data in there to do their own analytics. So we're not prescriptive about how people use our data, but I think there's probably two very clear use cases there. One is around our data model and analytics type use cases, and then there's the much more real-time, get the data into the fraud management system for real-time decisioning, absolutely in the moment.
Thank you. The next question, does the system cater for both early detection and for post-event review?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually the point I was making just a moment ago, which is the data model is first and foremost for that sort of post-event review. The way I characterized that was those two key use cases: understanding the impact on the customer experience. Are you annoying your customers? Are you creating discontent and churn? The data gives that insight. And then, of course, understanding those emerging threats, which is just so important. This is an arms race, to put it quite candidly. The arms race is the race between our customers who are trying to defend their systems from the fraudsters, and the fraudsters who are, trying to work their way around it. And it's worth keeping in mind as well that the war here, the arms race here, is not the one-off sort of nomad or rogue fraudster. It's the industrial scale fraud, which is what worries our customers and the customers who will buy the fraud data platform. It's the industrial scale fraudsters who find a systematic way of defrauding the organization from really significant amounts of money. And they are very expert in what they do. They find really clever techniques to find their way into the system. And fraud detection has a lifetime value. It has a short value, a sort of a half-life, I suppose you might call it, after which the fraudsters will find new ways in. And so being able to collect the data and understand how those patterns are evolving is absolutely essential, because whatever models and whatever clever techniques are deployed today will have significantly less value in a month and 6 months and a year's time.
Very good, and I think naturally following on from that question as well, the next one is considering the ecosystem of fraud prevention, how does this fit in with ID verification solutions such as GB Group and other fraud management systems? Yeah,
it's an ideal fit, I think. I think those potential partners that we're talking to see the value really clearly. Digital is not an area which is really native or well understood by them. They typically come very much more from the money laundering, the regulatory side of the fraud detection world. So this world is really new to them. And the platform which underpins the fraud data platform, which is the same platform that underpins our customer data platform in the marketing world, brings with it all the strengths that we have going back, 20 years now. So we have a product and a platform which is really battle hardened. We do real time. Everything we do is real time nowadays. And our ability to feed the right signals, the right evidence, the right data into those fraud management systems at the right time is exactly what they need. We're not trying to be the decisioning product. We understand that we are fitting into the broader ecosystem where the fraud management system owns the decision and takes data from many different sources. But our focus on digital data is going to be a really valuable input to them, so that at the end of the day, they can catch more fraudsters with fewer false positives. That's what the whole thing is about, and proving that efficacy is central to that as we move forward.
Very good, thanks. So you showed us the example of the HSBC student. How much bespoke work is undertaken in order to deploy the platform for each individual customer?
Yeah, I think there will be a modest amount of configuration to set up each customer. I think actually the fraud data platform is more out of the box than the customer data platform. When we set up for the marketing world, there's typically many more decisions to be made around where you personalize and the customer experience and all sorts of decisions that get made there. The fraud data platform work, from what we're seeing as it's evolving and developing, is a much more out of the box experience. So there will be changes and refinement, especially around the models. Model refinement is, of course, an ongoing thing, a part of any deployment. But I think one of our key benefits, and it's always been one of our benefits, is about getting up and running quickly so that you can deploy Celebrus to your website or to your mobile application and literally have data flowing on day one of it running. It is that straightforward. Now, of course, I won't say that someone buys this and it will be live within a day, because there is always a process that goes through. Any organization buying Celebrus has to go through a process which typically takes 6 weeks, is pretty normal. During that time, there'll be some security audits to make sure they understand what's being done and where. There's obviously the technicalities of standing the product up, but actually that part of things is very fast these days. We have a really fantastic story around quick deployment using all the very latest cloud technologies. So I think the actual longer term play here is just to make this absolutely seamless for customers to get up and running really quickly and get the improved decisions into their fraud management systems.
So would you say that the Fraud Explorer extension is an extension of the original customer experience application, where the customer has a better experience with less authorization hurdles to jump through to achieve the desired outcome?
Yeah, there is a fascinating backdrop to that question, which is you could actually, an organization, for example, a retail bank, could eliminate all fraud. They could absolutely drop fraud to near zero. Unfortunately, that would mean they had no customers as well, because the friction in the customer journey would be so great that it would just drive customers away in droves. So every financial services institution is treading a careful line between the operational losses from their fraud side of the house with the customer journey and customer experience on the other side. So most banks, most insurers will accept a certain level of fraud in their fraud operations, but clearly what they want to do is to drive that down without affecting customer experience, and it is that balancing act which is absolutely central. And to the points which we've walked through in the demo, those are the two things which we are focusing on: the ability to measure and understand customer experience and the impact there, with also having the real-time fraud detection to actually drive the fraudsters away from the customer's web and mobile.
And are there GDPR issues with the data which you collect from the platform at the moment, or is that your end customer's responsibility?
The legal basis actually for data collection is a really interesting area. So I think most people now are fairly aware of how GDPR has impacted data collection for marketing purposes, and in a word, it's consent. You absolutely have to have consent to collect marketing data or data for marketing purposes. So if you want to collect data for an individual on which you're going to send marketing emails or perhaps retarget them on Facebook or these sorts of activities, then you have to have consent. And that is the story, not just in Europe actually, it's actually the story in the US for CPRA, it's the story across the world in almost every jurisdiction. This is becoming legal jurisdiction, this is becoming the norm now. They all, without exception, carve out an exception to that, which is if you're collecting data for fraud detection, then you don't have to have consent. In GDPR, it's called legitimate interest. That's a different legal basis for collecting data, where you don't have to ask for consent to collect data because you're not using it for marketing purposes. You're actually using it to protect the customer, to protect the customer's account, to protect the customer's money. And therefore, it doesn't have to go through the same consent-based legal basis. So we actually see, we have two products in this space. We have the CDP for marketing and we have the fraud data platform for obviously fraud detection, and they primarily sit on top of a different legal basis. So consent for the CDP and legitimate interest for the fraud data platform, the FDP.
Very good indeed. Thank you very much. I think that's running up against time for us now. So thank you very much, Ant. And thank you very much to Bill for his earlier introduction. And here ends the webinar.